Alright. It's kind of a nice spring night. I'm just sitting outside in front of my house. I woke up in the middle of the night, as I sometimes do. So I thought I would just come and sit here for a while, because it's so nice. Anyway, I thought I would talk about the incel thing. Although a lot has already been said about it, maybe too much already, by other people. But maybe I have something to add. The most interesting thing about this is how the incel meme broke into the mainstream media and mainstream awareness. And it did so, I guess, because of the Alec Manassian mass murder. This guy in Toronto who went on a rampage, killed a bunch of people with a van, and apparently posted to Facebook a kind of joking, like 4chan-inspired message. Now, to me, that Facebook post looks like it might be bogus. So I would be skeptical of that because it looks more like a kind of hoax than the real thing. But whether or not it is by him, the mainstream media took this incel meme and they ran with it. And this has exposed the, secret and horrible world of incels to mainstream consciousness. Now, of course, it's kind of silly because these people, first of all, they don't know what they're talking about, and secondly, they don't really care about the truth. They're pushing an ideological angle. But in spite of that, they've brought this meme into mainstream awareness, and it sort of carried along with it some memetic baggage that is kind of important. Like the idea that the sexual market is broken, that we don't have a sexual utopia, right? That modernity, the sexual revolution did not create a sexual utopia. That there are a lot of losers in this sexual market, and a lot of them are men. That the dynamics of the modern sexual market cause a lot of men to drop out. And I suppose I should say that this incel thing was a kind of joke, right? I mean, the incel meme has been out there for years. I can't remember when I first saw it, but, it's been out there in various forms. Gymcel, Volcel, like all these little variations on it for years. And it was a sort of tongue-in-cheek hyperbole, somewhat ironic, but also somewhat truthful meme. It was like a way of conveying the sexual desperation of a lot of young men. Whether or not they were actually, virgins in their 30s or whatever, or even 20s. It was more that a lot of young men were, in this TFW, no GF state, right? That this is a kind of epidemic. It's a real problem, And this is something that poses a big problem for the left, politically, and for the humanist worldview, ideologically, I guess, or theologically. I guess I should start with the humanist worldview and why it poses a problem for that, and then I'll go to the problems it poses for the left. But first I just wanted to say that it's a kind of joke, but at the same time there's an underlying truth, and the mainstream media have now picked up on it, and they don't really understand internet culture. They don't understand that everything is somewhat ironic and that there are layers of irony and stuff like that. And that the incel community is very small, but the meme refers to something much bigger, which is the dysfunction in the sexual market that leaves a lot of men shut out of sex and love. And the reason this poses a problem for the humanist worldview is that this shouldn't happen. This just wasn't supposed to happen. Because in the humanist worldview, humans are essentially good, and human nature is essentially good. So it shouldn't produce bad outcomes by itself. It should require something else to produce a bad outcome, right? And humanists assume that if you give humans enough resources and enough freedom, then you will get a good outcome, right? So they assume that all problems are due to things like, not enough resources, like poverty, or bad ideas like, other religions, or things like Nazism or whatever, hate, that kind of thing. They think hate is the result of ideologies. Or a lack of freedom or oppression of some kind, some sort of boot on the neck or something like that. And what has happened over the last 50 years or so, or actually on a longer time span, is that people have gotten an abundance of resources, generally speaking, in the developed world, right? So modernity has abundance as one of its defining characteristics. And these other religions have been kind of shooed away, right? Like we've gotten rid of either these superstitions or their practical effects. Things like traditional marriage, traditional sexual morality, slut shaming, all that stuff has been removed, right? And humanists would have viewed that as a kind of imposition on human nature. So we have removed the resource constraints, not only with abundance, but also with the welfare state. In the modern developed world, almost all children live to adulthood, right? The state does not allow children to starve or adults to starve, unless they're like really far gone and the state can't really help them. So modernity has pretty much guaranteed survival and removed some of these moral constraints, or the way humanists would see them, some of these superstitions and bad ideas, and has given people sexual freedom, right? Like you can have sex with anyone you want now, right? That's the liberated condition of modernity, the sexually liberated condition of modernity. You are free to have sex with anyone you want if they agree. So this, in the humanist worldview, should almost be a utopia, right? It should pretty much be paradise. And yet, it falls significantly short of paradise. It has a lot of problems. The modern sexual market is, it's very inegalitarian, for one thing. But it also just doesn't work. Like, it's not bringing men and women together into loving relationships. It's not creating love, and it's not even creating sex. Like, it's not even like leading to this, big free love party, right? So the humanist worldview can't really explain what went wrong. And it can't explain why 20% of young men are dropping out of the sexual market. Like, have no realistic prospects of getting sex and love. The reason why the humanist worldview didn't predict this is partly because of its, idealistic assumptions about human nature, but also because of romantic delusions about what sexual relationships are and what love is. This romantic illusion, the idea that love is, a kind of magical thing that stars cross in the sky, or, it's just like we have this taboo on talking honestly about how it works and what it is. And in the place of a real understanding of love and sex, we have these romantic illusions. This, Hollywood narrative of boy meets girl. The idea that there's someone out there for everyone. And this idea that it'll just happen. When it's supposed to happen, it'll happen. You'll meet the right person, and there will be chemistry, and you will be drawn toward each other, blah, blah, blah. And what this ignores is that what's really going on is you have beings, males and females, men and women, and I'm just going to assume heterosexuality. So you have men and women that have brains that evolved to reproduce, right? So you have reproducing machines that perceive each other as having value, potential value as mates. And this perception is based on kind of heuristic emotions that evaluate a potential mate. So, in other words, sexual preferences. But when we say sexual preferences these days, it usually means like, what kind of body do you like? Do you like a man or a woman or whatever, right? But I mean more along the lines of, like, what do women find attractive in men, and what do men find attractive in women? Well, it's not like stars crossing in the sky that make people attracted to one another. It is their brains, and their brains perceiving value in the other. And that perception of value is based on the biological utility of the other. And sexual relationships are exchange relationships. So that's the fundamental point. That's the key thing you have to understand. That what brings men and women together is a deal. A deal that's usually implicit, but is still there, right? It's usually brokered by emotions and not consciously, but there's an element of consciousness to it. The deal is the man provides survival-related services. He helps the woman and her children to survive by protecting her children, and providing them with food and shelter and whatever he can do for them. And the woman provides the man with reproductive services. She bears him children, and she raises those children, right? So that's the deal. That's what I call the sexual contract, the implicit deal between male and female. And our feelings of sexual attraction and so on evolved to get a good deal, to get a good mate, a good return on your investment in that relationship. And that's what we hide behind this veil of ignorance, these romantic illusions that are really they're really just a veil of ignorance, right? It's fluffy words and a kind of taboo on talking about this realistically, right? Talking about what really goes on in people's heads. That love, this kind of love, the love between a man and a woman, the love of a sexual relationship, is not magic. It is selfish. It's cooperative, but it's not altruistic. There is the potential for conflict and for defection on both sides. And it's also very inegalitarian. And it's not free. The concept of free love is ridiculous. Love is an exchange. You have to give something to get something back. And what I've been talking about for a long time is that, and not just me, of course, lots of other people too, in these heretical thought spaces, is that modernity has taken away men's purchasing power in this market, in the market for these deals, because men used to offer women these survival-related services. They used to be able to provide those to a woman in exchange for sex and love, or in other words, reproductive services. But now, the state provides women with a guarantee of survival, right? We have collectivized survival, but reproduction is still very individualistic. We haven't collectivized sex. We collectivized survival, but not reproduction, right? So when women have their survival subsidized by the state, partly by abundance and partly by welfare, and also there's an interaction with the birth control pill, which by eliminating children frees women from their fulfilling their biological purpose, and thus kind of gives them more freedom to not need a man, let's say. So all of those things together have really reduced the value of men to women. Now, women still perceive men to be attractive because our emotions are heuristics. They're not a perfect calculation of reproductive utility, right? They're just a bunch of heuristics that evaluate things that in the past, were positive or negative for reproduction, but might not be quite that way today, right? So you've got to take psychology into account. You can't just base everything on this kind of naive evolutionary psychology where you assume that whatever is reproductively useful will be done. That's not how the brain works. But, once you understand that psychological layer a little bit, just understand that it's driven, that we're driven by emotions, and that those emotions are heuristic. Once you understand that, it becomes very predictable, or at least it was predictable that something would probably go wrong as a consequence of modernity. And I should point out that it isn't female nature that is the problem. It's not that, like, this is the MGTOW explanation, right? It's female nature is the problem. Women are hypergamous. Well, sure, women are hypergamous, but men are, like, polygamous or whatever. You know, they want to have sex with lots of women. So, women want to have sex with the best men. So that's not really the issue. That's not a problem. That just means that men and women have different preferences. So it's not that female nature is the problem. And it's not like the MRAs think, which is that feminism is the problem. I'm not saying feminism isn't a problem, but it isn't the problem. It's just part of the problem. The problem with the modern sexual market is mainly because modernity has created this imbalance that women perceive men as not having a lot of value, because men are no longer essential for survival. But women are still, at least perceived, to have high value by men. Now, they appear to have high reproductive utility to men. You know, you see an attractive woman, you see she has hips, breasts, she's young, and your brain says that's high value. But a woman sees a man walking down the street and she doesn't perceive any need for a man, and she doesn't see him as having any power to do something that she doesn't have, and so she perceives him to not be very attractive. So that's the problem. That's the main problem, and then throwing away traditional sexual morality is also part of the problem. I suppose I should have said that is not in itself the problem, though. That's what traditionalists think, right? Like the religious traditionalists think that, well, it's just because we threw away marriage and sexual morality, and we just need to go back to it. Well, it's not that simple. It's not just that. It's also abundance and the welfare state, and even to some extent the market and the birth control pill. So it's all of that stuff together. Okay, that was a kind of long-winded, well, it's not that long considering what's being explained, but if you've heard it all before, it might have been kind of boring. Anyway, so that's what's really going on, and that reality has been hidden away by romantic illusions and a complete refusal to be realistic about this aspect of our lives, you know, about what sex and love really are and how they work. I feel like I'm supposed to say something now that I forgot to say. Oh well. Anyway. So the humanist worldview would have predicted a sexual utopia, and instead we have a sexual dystopia. And one of the interesting things about this development, with the incel meme breaking into the mainstream consciousness, is that it's pulling this reality into the Overton window. There was an article in the New York Times by a guy named, I think it's Ross or Russ Doubthat, something like that, I think it was called The Redistribution of Sex. And he was talking about something that was written by an economist, a kind of heretical economist, you know, an edgosphere economist, about the unequal distribution of sex and how we might change it. And, this created a huge backlash, and now this New York Times article, of course, is getting a backlash. But what's cool is that these things are now being discussed in the mainstream, however imperfectly, whereas, 5 years ago, that was entirely confined to little dark corners of the internet, like the manosphere. So that's kind of cool. I might talk a little bit more about that article later and what it suggests we should or will do to solve this problem. But first I want to say why the sexual dystopia and the incel meme pose problems for the left. The left is like the militant political wing of humanism, I guess. They're like militant humanists. Kind of. Sort of. Not exactly. Anyway, we'll set that aside, what they are. But, okay, so this poses a number of problems for the left. One is that they normally portray themselves as taking the side of the people at the bottom, right? The disadvantaged. The losers of society. Not the winners, but the losers. And in this scenario, these guys, and I don't just mean the incel community, but the men who are shut out of the sexual market, are losers. They're the ones at the bottom, right? And there's a very clear parallel between the distribution of sex and the distribution of wealth. Both are distributed unequally. And when it comes to wealth, the left is in favor of redistributing wealth, right? You take from the haves and you give to the have-nots. But when it comes to sex, they have to take the opposite position, that the have-nots are deserving of their status as have-nots. It's their job to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? So they're individualistic about sex and collectivistic about wealth, right? There's this asymmetry in leftism, especially feminism, where they're very concerned about individual freedom when it comes to sex, but not so much when it comes to wealth. Over there, they're really concerned about the equitable distribution of outcomes, right? They're not so much concerned about freedom, like economic freedom, but equality of outcomes. But when it comes to sex, they have to take the opposite view, right? They become suddenly ultra-libertarian, and it's the job of the have-nots to, figure out their problem, or it's their own fault for, being bad people or whatever. Like, there's this, this is one of the responses, that these people are just bad people, and that's why they can't get love and sex, right? And that might, maybe that's true for some, but it can't really explain the numbers, like when you look at the statistics. But they have to blame those people for their fate, or just admit that it's due to their innate characteristics. Like, you're just born unattractive. You're short, or you're ugly, right? Or something like that. So it's either your fault, you didn't work hard enough, or it's your personal responsibility to get love and sex, and if you can't get it, that's your problem. And possibly it's just due to some innate characteristics that you can't change, and yet we're supposed to accept this unequal distribution of outcomes as natural and morally acceptable. So what they won't accept for the distribution of wealth, they will accept for the distribution of sex. So there's that hypocrisy or double standard, and that's a problem for them. And it's especially a problem if we phrase it in terms of love rather than sex. right? Because then it's really emotionally charged. Like you say, these people will live their lives without love, and you don't care. You're willing to let that happen. You heartless libertarian, you sexual libertarians. I'm not saying we should redistribute sex, but, we should fix the system so it works, right? There are still going to be unequal outcomes, but we should fix the system so it works. So it works better. But anyway, I'm just talking about how it affects the left. It brings out this hypocrisy. It forces them to take the side of the winners against the losers, the powerful against the weak, right? That's the other thing this does, is it exposes that there are kinds of power that are important that are not economic or institutional, right? Because the left is always trying to redistribute financial and institutional power, but they ignore other kinds of power, especially sexual power, which, especially in this environment, is mostly in the hands of women. And the sexual market is driven by female preferences. And that's a problem as well. That's a problem for their narrative, because it means that women aren't these weak, helpless beings that, need so much help. There are ways in which women are stronger than men, in which women have more power in this environment, in this system, than men, especially young women, right? So that's a problem for them, and that their pet policies are making this happen, right? That to some extent the welfare state and sexual liberation, which are the two cornerstones of leftism, that those things are responsible to a large extent for creating this imbalance in the sexual market and this breakdown of relationships. And again, if we frame this as the love deficit or something like that, that will be very rhetorically effective, because love is this core value for the left. Whether they actually practice it, of course they don't, but the word love, it's a sacred word almost. Anyway, okay, I think I spent too long trying to explain that. It could have been done better, but oh well. It's late at night and I'm a little bit sleepy. Alright, so I just want to talk briefly about that article. And what it proposed, I shouldn't say proposed, because he was sort of just suggesting that we might do this. He didn't say we should, but he sort of did. He was saying that we will probably solve this not by a return to traditional sexual morality. Well, I suppose I should say, first of all, that he actually gave a pretty good overview of the problem. It wasn't perfect, but he certainly did a very good job for something that ended up in the New York Times, right? So let's give the guy his due. But then he went on to suggest that a possible solution to this problem is better illusions, like sex robots or VR, better porn, all that stuff, right? That these loveless men, these poor saps who are the losers in this brave new world, their problem will be solved with technology. He was proposing a kind of deus ex machina, which is the standard approach, by the way, that people seem to take to problems that we create for ourselves. We seem to assume that we'll just be able to solve every problem with technology. We'll just kind of invent our way out of every problem. And so he was proposing that I mean, he wasn't exactly proposing it, but he was sort of suggesting that this might be a solution, and this is what we'll probably do. That will basically replace human sexual relationships for these losers, these dropouts, with fake ones, with simulacra. And while that might be somewhat true about what's going to happen, I think it should be obvious that this is not a solution. And I just wanted to say a few things about that. It's almost insulting, right? It's like saying to the nerds, okay, you guys can't get laid, so go invent yourselves some sex robots and, just fap to your heart's content, and then have no kids, and, just get lost, right? Just fap your way off the stage of history, of course, who's going to solve the next problem when all the nerds don't reproduce, right? So of course, we're not at the point yet where the New York Times is going to admit that dysgenics is an issue and eugenics is a necessity. But, well, I don't know. Maybe that's coming. We'll see. But the main problem with that idea is that it just doesn't solve the problem. It might give people orgasms, okay. It might be sufficient to give people orgasms. And you can have imaginary relationships with 2D waifus or whatever. Kind of, tweak your emotions in that way. But it's not real, and you're not going to reproduce that way. And this is not a way forward for a society, right? This is just adding another layer of illusions to deal with the problem created by not facing reality. It's like, oh, well, we weren't facing reality, so we created all these problems. But now let's create even better virtual reality to hide the problems, so we can keep going forward into dystopia. Just a very strange attitude, but anyway. But it's kind of interesting to see this stuff getting into the mainstream awareness, like getting into the Overton window, being openly discussed. And I think it's a sign of the times. You could call this time the great disillusioning. We're seeing our cherished illusions coming into conflict with reality. A lot of the sacred beliefs of our culture are starting to come into conflict with reality in ways that are hard to deny, And of course the reaction is to deny them harder, that's one reaction. But eventually the truth gets through. Eventually reality always wins these games of chicken, Like you can't, if you plot a collision course with reality, you're not going to win. So, anyway. Yeah, it's just been kind of interesting seeing this little event unfold. Alright, I'm really sleepy now, so I'm going to go to bed. If I forgot to say something, well, maybe it'll be in the text version of this. I'll try to put together a text version that's more coherent. This is the relaxed and incoherent extemporaneous version. Alright, as always, thanks for listening. Have a good night.